Before we get started, just a reminder that you can find all of my available rental properties on my website at marcguzman.com. If you own investment property, click on the Owner Services section to see our complete list of services. Thank you to our sponsor for today's episode, East Brother Beer. Located on Canal Boulevard in Point Richmond, East Brother Beer mixes classic brewing styles with precision and modern sensibility to create the perfect Bay Area craft beer. You may not know who Howard Jarvis is, but if you live in California, he has had a major impact on your life without you even realizing it. Back in the 1970s, Jarvis was a Republican lobbyist who resented the power of big government. He led a massive campaign to slash property taxes in California and succeeded in 1978 with the passing of Prop 13. With its passing, property taxes were slashed to 1% of the purchase price while also setting a cap of 2% on how much property taxes could be raised year to year. While the initiative saved Californians thousands of dollars, its long-term impacts have had seriously negative consequences for many programs in California, chief among them being education. Today, Prop 13's popularity in California has made it a third rail, threatening political death to any politician aiming to curb it. Our guests today are Jason Cohn and Camille Servan-Schreiber, who have produced a film called The First Angry Man, which captures Howard Jarvis's quest to put Prop 13 on the ballot and further explores the long-lasting consequences it has had on the state. The film will be seen at the SF Urban Film Festival as well as the SF Indie Film Festival taking place February 2nd through the 9th. Later this year, a measure on the 2020 ballot will seek to roll back some of Prop 13's protections on commercial and industrial properties, possibly even second homes. In this episode, Jason, Camille, and I discuss the film as well as Prop 13's impact on California and its future. Jason, Camille, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to be here.
So one thing I like to ask every single guest is what currently has your attention? It could be a book, politics, movies, music. What has your current attention?
Well, you want to start?
Well, I'm started working on another project, a film project that's looking at the homelessness crisis in California. So that has a lot of my attention. Looking at how big a problem it has become, it continues to be, how far we are from solving it, and yet looking at possible solutions that could be implemented. But looking in detail at what the housing affordability crisis is in California and realizing the depths of that. And interestingly enough, how it actually connects to a lot of the work that we have been doing on our film about Prop 13. Because a lot of the problems we have now have really started in about 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your research in homelessness, have you seen what a potential solution to that could be?
There's not a solution. There is no silver bullet. There's lots of problems. But there's lots of very interesting and intelligent people who are really trying to tackle it from different angles. But it will sound like a cliche, but it will take absolutely everybody getting on board and lots of agencies and lots of partnerships, public and private, working together to solve it. Because it is not, we are no longer in the world where the government is going to solve the problem. So
I can give you a perfect example where City of Oakland, in a neighborhood, they have an issue with homelessness, right? And a lot of the homeowners in that neighborhood are constantly complaining about homelessness. And so City of Oakland owns a piece of land there, and they decided, well, we're going to build 88 small, tiny living
homes.
Units,
Yeah.
Tiny homes, yeah. And they're using a company called Factory OS out of Mare Island in Vallejo, and they make these tiny, very awesome little apartments, and they slap them
really
together.
Cool. Yeah.
And so the plan was to do 88 units and house and assign a manager to then assign it to the local homeless population. But the city of Oakland has two problems. Number one, you have the homeowners complaining about homelessness problem, but then they also complain they don't want the homeless housed in that neighborhood on the empty piece of land. And the third problem, or the second problem, is City of Oakland is being delayed in constructing the project because they cannot issue permits to their own city.
That's an issue.
Yeah. So it's definitely, and I bring that up because of what you said, that the governments are having trouble fixing this problem, and it's really going to come down to us, the citizens, to step in and figure out solutions to this.
And part of it is accepting that it's a problem and believing it can be solved. I think, a lot of...
I think we're past the point of denying that there's a problem. I mean, it's so apparent in our everyday lives now. I mean, you can't walk past, an overhang on the sidewalk without seeing somebody who's basically taken up permanent residence there. It's, these things that used to be sort of anomalies are just, it's our everyday life now in the Bay Area. There's so many, like every open space has basically been colonized by small encampments.
It's horrible. I mean, it's absolutely horrible. Yeah. But what I mean by people are going to need to accept it is they're going to need to accept that our entire society has to come to terms with it to have solutions. You can't just say, no, we need to fix the problem, but just not next to my house. Yeah. No, you can't build that affordable housing unit next to my house. I want it elsewhere. Where? The Bay Area is very dense as it is. And so that's what I mean. There's a lot of people who haven't come to terms to the fact that the whole NIMBY thing, not in my backyard movement, is not helping. And we need to find solutions and fast for people who are, they are neighbors. They used to be our neighbors, and something happened in their life. They were down on their luck, and they lost their housing. And losing their housing in California today means you can end up on the street with no access to water, with no access to toilets, and you live, it feels like we're living in a third world country when you go into some neighborhoods in Oakland or in LA or actually all around California right now.
And living in the streets can be very dangerous because many people are fighting for very minimal resources. And I mean, people are faced with stabbings and shootings and robberies.
It's going to become a public health crisis for all of us, not just the people who are living on the street. So
true. And look at San Francisco right now, where they spend about $5 million a year in a team just to go around cleaning human feces.
Yeah.
It's not just dangerous. It's really dangerous to people's healths. I mean, when you age, when you hit the streets and you have to live there, you age disproportionately to the years that are passing or the months that are passing, and it's also terribly damaging to your mental health. I mean, how people talk a lot about there's problem with drugs and alcohol abuse and mental health issues in the community, but honestly, if you think about sleeping in the streets now in the winter in Oakland or San Francisco, it's hard to do without taking something to actually sustain you. The answer is not to treat that problem first. The answer is house them, get people shelter, and then they can tackle their issues. So you have to be humane about the way you approach the problem.
I will say this, there's suddenly money that appears to be available for it, right? So like Gavin's new budget has like $1.4 billion, and you have Apple and Google and all of these big companies that are suddenly realizing that they're basically symbols of California, Apple and Google and these big Silicon Valley companies, and they therefore have some responsibility for solving this problem, which is, marring the very state of our face of our state is what I wanted to say. And so, I think there's something like $5 or $6 billion on the table, which may be a drop in the bucket. I don't know. But I mean, it seems like a significant amount of money to start.
At least it shows that there's a start of thinking about philanthropy and how big corporations can have an effect. I mean, Kaiser Permanente has been a great leader in the field. They actually started several years back before some of these other bigger companies, really saying, we can't let people live like this. We need to do something. And they have engaged in a whole campaign to try to support organizations and programs that really are looking for solutions, and it's very with some very encouraging results.
Mm-hmm. So, and I believe a lot of this stems from just the continuing issue of wealth inequality, right?
Absolutely.
And this is going to transition into exactly why the two of you are here today, and about the film about Prop 13 and the history going behind it. So why don't you explain a little bit more of what prompted you to put a film together about Prop 13? I mean, usually we've had a few filmmakers here, and they're doing things about movies, certain idols. They're doing, storylines that they come up with. Usually, you don't hear someone going back and say, "Hey, let's talk about this tax proposition that happened 40 years ago."
Yeah.
So, what prompted this?
Well, obviously, you're used to having feature film people in here rather than documentary filmmakers. But we're documentary filmmakers. We're journalists, and we're interested in like Kemi's working on this project about homelessness because it's apparent, it's kind of in your face right now. And when we started working on this film about Proposition 13, it was close to 10 years ago now, I'm embarrassed to say, but we have been working on it about that long. And maybe there are a lot of people in your audience who are relatively new to California, and you might not know the story. California right now is kind of flush with money. We have like a budget surplus. We're doing all right.
I remember there was a deficit with Gray Davis when he was last in place.
Exactly.
We had chronic, and we have had throughout the course of the last 4 decades or so, chronic budget crises, budget deficits in California. And we kind of go through like boom and bust periods, and it's because of the nature of our tax structure. But around 10 years ago, we were really struggling, and you had furloughs, government workers were being furloughed. You had state parks closing. You had school hours and, school years were being shortened.
California was going to be the first failed state. It was going bankrupt. I mean, it was insane.
Yeah, Meg Whitman was running for president or for governor, in 2010, I think, and she was seriously suggesting that California file for bankruptcy.
It's interesting you say that because I remember that, but until you just brought it up right now, I had completely forgot about it. And it's very easy for most people to just, during good times, to forget about the bad times or forget about all the issues that led up to those bad times.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that long ago.
No, it really
was. It was just 10 years ago.
Yeah, so in the more recent years, we've had healthy budgets, we've had tax increases by way of the ballot box, but at that time, around 2010, 2011, when we started looking at this, it was a very grim outlook for California. And so it was, what was on everybody's mind at the time. Everybody was talking about it. And the conversation always seemed to kind of dead end in this Proposition 13 thing, We would say, well, we can't do anything about it because of the Prop 13 tax limits. And, I grew up in Los Angeles. I grew up in, I was alive when Prop 13 passed in 1978. I kind of vaguely remember it as being a big issue. And so I was interested in it, but I had to admit that I didn't really know anything about it or the history of it. And I just sort of had this feeling that since the conversation keeps dead-ending on this question of Prop 13 and how it limits our choices, that maybe from a journalistic perspective, it was actually worth having that as a starting point for looking at this issue to provide some sort of historical context for how we got to where we are. So started the research process of looking into it. That's how it began.
Yeah, and I really want to learn more about your film and your opinion and your take on what you've learned about Prop 13, because I've been in real estate now going on 17 years, and it's very interesting. When I got into real estate at the age of 18, and one of the things they teach you is Prop 13 is awesome. It's great for homeowners. It's great for the state of California, and people should buy a home because of Prop 13. That's one of the things that just becomes so ingrained in you
It's a mantra.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what you kind of put out there to your clients. But it's very interesting now because I got into real estate 2003, but now just seeing all the new realtors getting into the business, they're coming in with their own set of opinions. And I think part of it is because of the internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
2003, you still had the internet, but it wasn't as widely used as today.
Mm-hmm.
My first phone, which was a flip phone, I got it when I turned 18 years old. But nowadays, you have the younger generation, elementary, they've got access to the internet.
Yeah,
and it's
that's
amazing.
That's how we get all our information now.
Yeah, and it's amazing to hear like middle schoolers talking about politics and different laws and what they think is right and wrong. That and I think that's one of the benefits that the internet's brought on board. And so you're seeing a big change in how people view Prop 13. And of course, this year in 2020, we have Prop 13 being proposed to be chopped up by a few different people, different proposed laws. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
I think it's important to remind people that Prop 13 is often mostly thought about from a perspective of real estate and private property owners, owning your home and how much that has benefited you or the people who have been lucky enough to buy a house. That's one piece of it. But the other piece of it is that when Prop 13 passed, it wasn't just solving a problem that we can talk about in more detail for homeowners. It also locked in a tax rate for corporations, for big real estate owners, for big companies like PG&E,
or Disney,
for example. Disney is not going to move. They're never going to pick up Disneyland and move it somewhere else. So that location has a locked-in rate from 40 years ago. That has not changed. And so the situation, whereas houses get turned around, people eventually move, pass it down to someone else, or, whereas the companies have benefited, large companies, large landowners have benefited more than homeowners. The other thing that was all wrapped in Prop 13, it was a simple proposition, but it did a lot of things, was that it locked in the need for a 2/3 majority to pass any tax increase. And 2/3 majority is a very high bar. And
right, so it's not just, most people think that Prop 13 really just affects property taxes, but it's not true.
That's right.
It makes it very difficult for the state legislature to raise any taxes because you need basically a supermajority to do it. And that was, built into the design of Prop 13. Howard Jarvis, who wrote Proposition 13, did not want the legislators to be able to turn around and sort of recoup the lost property tax revenue by increasing taxes on other things. And it's been pretty successful at doing that. But, we need the revenue, and so we're always finding new and kind of creative ways of getting money for us. So, maybe it's when you go to park your car now, instead of it, putting a quarter into the meter, it's $5.
So the burden of the cost has shifted and is much heavier on people who have less money. It's a much more regressive way of taxing people.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems when you see a lot of the new tax bills that come into place. Who's really paying these taxes? Mm-hmm. And if you're continuing to tax the average person, and the average person is, making $35,000, $40,000 a year, well, any fixed dollar tax is going to affect them greatly.
Exactly.
Right? And it's going to affect them less than someone who's making $100,000 a year. Mm-hmm. And then it gets to a point where if it becomes too unaffordable, they move, and then it's only the wealthy that stay here. And we go back into that issue of, well, are we creating California into a super wealthy state and not a well-rounded state?
A super unequal state.
Correct, yeah. So who is Howard Jarvis? What was his role in putting together Prop 13?
So he's this really fascinating character. He's kind of considered a kind of a folk hero of the modern conservative movement. He predates, the Ronald Reagan revolution in a sense, although Reagan was governor at the same time that he was active. But Howard Jarvis was a small businessman from a really small town in Utah. He was, really kind of an interesting character. He was an athlete. He was like an amateur boxer and an amateur baseball player. And then he started running for office, and he was really unsuccessful running for office. He was never elected to anything, kept trying, ended up buying a newspaper in his hometown of Magna, Utah, and turned that into a string of small newspapers across Utah and did pretty well as a small business owner. Then he moved to Los Angeles in like the 1930s or 1940s, and he hooked up with the sort of fringe conservative movement around Orange County and the San Fernando Valley that was starting to grow around then. And California was a kind of moderate state at the time. You often had politically moderate place. Like you had, you would typically have a Republican governor, Republican senators, but they were very moderate by today's standards. And so he didn't really find a place politically in California. He kept trying to push these, he's very anti-communist for one thing. He's a little bit paranoid in that way.
I think a lot of people were at the time.
Yeah, a lot of people were, but he was kind of on the fringe. He was sort of
more right-wing than your average person.
Yeah, he was involved with like the John Birch Society and stuff like that. They were kind of on the paranoid fringe of things. He ran for Senate in 1962, and he, got a little bit of attention, but he failed in his bid.
But at the time, California was doing really well. It was really the golden age of California.
Mm-hmm.
People were moving in droves, actually, in the 60s because, the weather was beautiful. There was plenty of housing. There were plenty of jobs. And the state, it feels like the state was like a giant construction site at the time.
Mm-hmm.
They were constructing highways and water projects and schools and houses everywhere. So it was this booming, exciting place.
And a lot of that was really driven by government spending, federal government spending and state spending. Look, right now it's sort of a blip in California's economy, but at the time, like aerospace was huge in California, and that was all driven by, defense spending, federal defense spending, and NASA, had research labs and stuff out here, jet propulsion labs.
Well, Lockheed's been around here forever, but Lockheed is now beginning to move a lot of their departments and components out of California.
Right. But like the percentage of California's GDP that is driven by, let's say, federal spending on aircraft or aviation research and stuff like that is tiny now. But like in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, it was a really big part of California's overall employment picture, right? So it was just a really different time. Like budgets, or I should say, government spending on things really was making California into this sort of paradise for people who wanted to come from, cold climates and other places to to live in California and have our, beautiful weather and our beautiful scenery, but also have these great jobs. So it was really a very different time.
But then things started changing, with the end of the 60s and the 70s. Lots of things started happening that sort of changed the mood in the nation and in California. And starting there, Jarvis kind of found his footing and found people who were more aligned with his positions. And he started working towards reducing taxes. And
so that really started with his campaign in 1962 for Senate. He was not really getting traction on, his anti-communism stuff and all of that, but he did find this issue, which was taxes. And especially when he would go out into like the rural areas and, sort of suburban areas, he found that there were a lot of people who really responded to his tax arguments. And so I think that he started to kind of shed his, hardcore anti-communist side, and he really became like a tax guy. He became this tax maven. And then he was sort of famously like they would call him a, what's the word? a fly in the ointment. He was a gadfly. That's the term. He was always just kind of buzzing around Sacramento and city council offices in Los Angeles, trying to convince people that taxes should be reduced. And then he really started focusing on the property tax.
And it's really interesting just discussing taxes in general, because on one end, we need taxes to fund the government in order to run all the services and society that we want to live in. But on the other end, no one loves paying taxes. And so it's kind of figuring out a balance from both ends to what we all really want, right? But when it goes from one extreme to the other, that's where you have some major shifts. And if you don't sit down to really look at the future consequences of some of these taxes and laws that go into effect, well, then we end up, 40 years later with a film about Prop 13 and discussing all the different issues coming out of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, let's see here. In 1965, California spent the fifth most in the U.S. on education.
Yeah, per capita spending on, per student, per pupil was really high. And it was part of what brought people out here. You had great schools, great weather, and
you had California had just started building the UC system. The UC system was free to students in California in the 60s. Free.
Wow, really?
Free.
Yeah, tuition free.
That seems like science fiction today, but that's why it was built. The idea was you invest in your population, you invest in your children, and by giving everybody a good education, you will have a better economy.
So by 2010, California is now the 43rd in spending, and we now have students graduating college with so much debt.
$40,000 or $50,000
burdened by debt. The student debt nationally, it's not just California, did not exist. The student debt didn't exist as a problem in the 1960s. Did not even exist.
No, in 1978, when Prop 13 passed, there was virtually zero student debt in California, and now we're at I can't remember if it's $1.5 trillion or $2.5 trillion or something.
I don't remember,
like
but
that,
it's over $1 trillion for sure.
Yeah,
it's a problem.
It's a crushing burden
on the economy at large.
Now, one of the arguments we hear quite a bit is, well, I don't have kids, so why should I have to pay more in property taxes to pay for kids that I don't have?
I think you often hear that from people who are happy to receive their Social Security checks from, which are paid for by people who are young and don't need Social Security. I just think that's sort of a dead end argument. We live in a society. We are a collection of 400 million people, but we're much more than a collection of 400 million people. We're a society, and we have shared burdens, shared obligations, and we have a shared responsibility to each other. And one of those key ones is educating all of our kids. We can't just educate, kids that look like us and share our genes.
And so with the lack of money going into education, we burden the students with more debt, which then prevents them from doing other things that could benefit their lives. In fact, one of the issues that we're facing in the real estate industry is that, the average home buyer is typically 34, 35 years old, the first-time home buyer. But that's changing because many of them are coming with student loan debt, and many times they cannot purchase a property unless they're current on their payments, but those payments count against what they can afford to buy. So they can't afford as much, or in some cases, they simply just can't buy a home. Now, there's a few lenders that are starting to come out and rolling in student loan debt into the mortgage.
It's not a sustainable path.
Exactly. And so we're continuing to create this society where the new people coming in are burdened with debt. And again, it goes back to just continuing that road path to wealth inequality and just making it worse.
Yeah.
I mean, this speaks to, what has happened, Prop 13 was sort of the spark that started everything. But what it started really is a national tax revolt. It started here in California, but then other states sort of copied the model. And we've been in 40 years of happy tax slashing all across the nation. And what it really means is it's a lot of people, mostly older white people, but a lot of people basically slamming the door behind them and saying, we had it good, we want to keep it this way, the way we have it, but we don't want others to benefit. This all started happening in the 70s in California because there was a change in demographics. All these people moving in included more Latinos, more, the schools became more diverse, the state became more diverse. And a lot of these older white property owners started to get a little worried about, wait a minute, so my taxes are actually going to help these people?
They're being shipped across town to help schools with kids that didn't look like their own kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's what a lot of it was.
And I think a lot of what has happened in the last 40 years looks a little bit like that. Let's close the door. We had it good. But we don't want to provide all of this to the next generation. And that's not really good for the future of our nation.
The tax revolt has largely been about a kind of generational transfer of wealth. It's definitely, it benefits people who already have money, and it tends to benefit older people. They're still getting their Social Security checks. But younger people of color, people starting to make their way into the workforce and wanting to buy a house, and have sort of the same opportunities that generation that's now in their 70s and 80s that they had, it's not working for them.
Yeah, and I think you can see it politically at the state level and where the entire shift is happening. You're seeing more people looking at Prop 13. In fact, it was the Legislative Analyst Office that I want to say maybe 2 or 3 years ago went to the state Senate and said, hey, look, you guys should look at Prop 13 because there's a shift in politics that we're seeing. But here are the numbers of what you can make as a state in terms of taxes if you just make this simple modification. Yep. And one of the modifications is, well, if you inherit a property, well, typically you also inherit the Prop 13 taxes, but you would not inherit those Prop 13 taxes if it was a second home or if you ended up converting it to an investment property. And I think most people tend to be on board with that, saying, well, okay, if I'm going to hold it as an investment, now I wasn't making any money before, but now even if I make $1 profit, it's still more than $1 or more. It's $1 more than what I had before. Yeah. I think most people would be okay with that, and that's kind of you start seeing that shift in the mentality of people living in California. Talking with a lot of clients about Prop 13, because there's been a lot of discussion about Prop 13, what's coming up, how should we handle this from a lot of different organizations. And so it's something that I've talked to clients and family and friends about, and it's very interesting because 17 years ago when I got into real estate, you talk to people about Prop 13, everyone's for Prop 13. Now, out of my small little circle, it's probably 50-50. Yeah. And a big change in how people are really viewing it.
So, they poll these questions a lot. The Public Policy Institute of California is a big polling agency. They're constantly consistently asking people about how they feel about Prop 13. And it seems like support for Prop 13 hasn't really softened that much overall. It still remains like more or less where it was when it passed, which was around 2/3 of Californians still approve of Prop 13. So I'm very curious to see, what's going to happen over the next year, because there is sort of the first major attempt to reform Prop 13 is very likely to be on the ballot in 2020. And it seems like there might be some softening around the edges in terms of how people feel about it. For a long time, it was treated as the third rail of California politics. You just do not you do not touch Prop 13. You don't talk about touching Prop 13. It's political suicide to even, mention the idea that you're going to reform it or, repeal it.
Nobody's talking about repealing it.
No, but if you look at the last 5 to 10 years, you've had major California politicians, Villaraigosa in Los Angeles, Gavin up here, and others who have, kind of put a stake in the ground saying that they're open to significant reform of Proposition 13 and saying that Prop 13 has had too many unintended consequences and we need to fix it. Mm-hmm. So I think that, those are markers at least that attitudes are changing, just the fact that politicians are willing to stick their necks out a little bit about it. So, we'll see, if the polling changes on it, and we'll definitely see what happens with this ballot initiative if it's able to cross the threshold or not. But
it's not on the ballot yet, so we'll see.
But it's always been considered like the thing you don't even talk about it in California.
Yeah. Now your film, The First Angry Man, this will be showcased at the San Francisco Urban Film Festival, as well as the SF Indie Film Festival taking place February 2nd and 9th.
Yes.
Where can people, if they cannot see the film at those film festivals, where can they capture and view the film?
Let's see, we have another local screening. We're going to be at the New Parkway Theater in Oakland on February 4th at 7 p.m. That's a really cool venue, the New Parkway Theater in Oakland. You can order pizza and drink beer, so,
But the film will be on PBS in the fall. We don't have a date yet because it's too far ahead. But we will also be holding a lot of community screenings that, if people are interested in hosting their own community screening, we are opting for this strategy because we think this film, we always meant this film to be the beginning of a conversation, because it is a film that looks at the history of Prop 13. It looks into the national consequences of Prop 13, but really it's meant to give you information to feed your interest on the topic. And we have discovered when we show this film to people that what they really want to do is have a talk about it afterwards together. So it's a great film to see as a group, as a community, at your school or anywhere. And so we have a website, and we have
firstangryman.com.
Perfect. We'll go ahead and link it up. And to wrap it up here, what would be the biggest takeaway you want the audience to take from your film?
I think that we want to kind of put a frame around this era, I'd say, is our biggest goal, is to have people realize that 1978, which is when this passed, was really like a watershed moment. And it started here in California, right in our backyards. And it kind of, it changed the whole way that we view our role as citizens. We started defining ourselves as taxpayers instead of as citizens. We started viewing our government as sort of the enemy that's trying to steal our money. Instead of seeing ourselves in partnership, in fact, seeing ourselves as the government. I mean, that's what we are, of the people, by the people, and for the people, right? It became a sort of us versus them moment where the government was, basically stealing our hard-earned money and wasting it, instead of the government, we are the government building a society that we all can believe in and share in. And so it's sort of this watershed moment, and this 40-year period that we live in, we think of it as the tax revolt era. And it's the water that we swim in, that joke about like the, fish don't know what air is because all they know is water. We're sort of like that. Like I feel that those of us who, are under the age of 65 or something like that, it's all we know. We have no memory of like the New Deal and the Great Society and this period before sort of the Reagan era and tax revolt era. But we're trying to like kind of put a frame around that and like have people realize that there's maybe other ways of doing things.
And when you look at what has happened in the last 40 years and the great rise in inequality in this country, clearly there is something that is
There's a
not
connection.
working. There is a connection, and it is worth looking at and thinking about other ways to do things.
Great. So for viewers, listeners, definitely go check out the website, check out the dates, and we'll have to do some kind of special screening too. We'll talk about that and figure it out.
Cool.
So
Sounds great.
thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you
It's
for
our
having
pleasure.
us.
Yeah,
It's
and
fun.
good luck to the film.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thank you to our producer, Sam Lubin. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the podcast on iTunes, Podbean, iHeartRadio, Google Play, SoundCloud, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. For more information on my business as a property manager and real estate team, go visit my website at marcguzman.com. I really want to thank all of you for listening. It means the world to me, and I hope today's episode provides you value in your day-to-day life. I created this podcast to help showcase the many great people that live in this world and help share some knowledge that I've learned along the way in life. Again, thank you for listening. Check out our sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next episode.